Welcome to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. I'm Christian of Standing Stones Healing, founder of the Reiki Business Collective and creator of the Build Your Reiki Business program, sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Greetings, welcome, and thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. It's Christian of Standing Stones Healing. So honored and excited to welcome you to this week's discussion of Reiki regulation. Should Reiki be regulated? What do you think? But first, I would like to invite you to join me for my free live Reiki business class this February. The Reiki Business Ready class is based on my Reiki Business Ready book to help you determine if it is time to start your Reiki business. In this class, you'll have the opportunity to connect with other Reiki practitioners to discuss your experiences and to determine if it is time to start your Reiki business and if you are ready to do it. You can learn more and save your spot at standingstoneshealing.com/ready class. But don't wait, because registration closes on February 1st. standingstoneshealing.com/ready class. So, should Reiki be regulated? This is a big question. And of course, there are lots of opinions about this. And I want to say right off the bat that, as with any opinion, there is no best opinion, there is no right or wrong. And there is a lot of nuance with this topic. So let's dive in. First, I would like to distinguish between standardization and regulation. So regulation is different from standardization. Regulation is when an industry, a practice, is governed by an authority, a professional organization, some governing body that sets up rules and laws and guidelines in order to define the practice. So with Reiki, regulation means certain standards and requirements. It means specific qualifications and training. It means oversight and monitoring of the practice. So a regulatory body that ensures that practitioners are adhering to certain standards. And regulation is used to promote safety and quality and to make sure that practitioners are performing in ways that advance the industry, that promote it in a positive and healthy way. Regulation in Reiki would look like, most likely, determining who can be a Reiki practitioner. So setting certain criteria for who can train and what that training is, what it looks like, and what it means to be certified, and the things that you need to do in order to be certified. It would most likely, regulation would define guidelines for ethical and professional behavior. And regulation may even impact where Reiki can be practiced and establish where one can practice Reiki. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds to me like a lot. Determining who can practice, where they can practice, what their training looks like, and etc. including making sure that everyone is practicing in the same way, or at least under a set of rules and regulations that establish the parameters. Standardization, on the other hand, is not the same as regulation, although regulation leads to standardization. So standardization is where there are certain standards of the practice in terms of things like what practitioners learn, the type of training they receive, maybe even standards of care for clients, standards of practice that aren't necessarily regulations and aren't necessarily enforced in the way that regulations are. So regulation leads to standardization, but standardization can be separate from regulation, if that makes sense. So standardization might look like establishing the common things that everyone learns in Reiki 1 or Reiki 2 or Reiki 3. So establishing standards for what is involved in training at each level. And regulation would not only create standardization of the teachings as part of the regulation, but there would also be structures in place to enforce that standardization and to make sure that teachers are complying and that there are consequences if they are not. Regulation has its pros and cons, and I will say that regulation in and of itself is not a bad thing, because without regulations, if you rent an apartment, it could be full of lead paint, or there may be no smoke detectors, and that would be completely legal without regulation. Without regulation, we could have car seats for children that malfunction in an accident. Without regulation, we wouldn't need to have fire exits. So regulation in and of itself is not always such a bad thing. But is it right for Reiki? Well, there are some pros to regulating Reiki. The first positive thing about regulating Reiki is that it would be seen as a professional practice. So with regulation, Reiki would have a code of ethics, which would create accountability for practitioners. People would take it more seriously, and there would even be the possibility of being able to use health insurance for Reiki because it's a professional practice. Regulating Reiki would also create more trust around the industry. So in last week's episode, I talked about Reiki scams, and they wouldn't go away because any industry can and does have scams, no matter how well regulated or professional it is. But it would indeed reduce the instance of scamming that can happen in the Reiki community. So it would create more trust with the practice itself, and it would lead, like I mentioned, to standardization. And as of now, there is no standardization in the teaching or practice of Reiki. So what that means is that anyone could teach anything they want to in a Reiki class, and even though it's not ethical, they could call it Reiki. So I could teach in my Reiki 1 class all kinds of things that are not part of Reiki, and I could teach all kinds of things that are not part of Reiki 1, and I could call it Reiki 1, and there's no consequence. There's no ramifications for me as a teacher for doing that. Now, of course, I could damage my reputation. Of course, I can have students who find out that I'm teaching all kinds of non-Reiki things, and word could get out and it could damage my reputation. But beyond that, there's no consequence. It's the same with a Reiki session. Since there are no standards, there's no standardization, anyone could do anything in a Reiki session and call it a Reiki session. And again, while that's not ethical, there are no ramifications. There are no consequences. There is no governing body to say, I can't do that. And regulation would fix that problem, which, let's admit, as much as we love Reiki and as much as we love the practice, that is a problem where anyone can call anything Reiki and there's no standardization. But of course, there are cons with regulating Reiki as well. First of all, the cost is a big one, because with regulation, there is always a cost. You have to pay for training, which is often much more expensive. And it's often much more expensive because the teachers have to pay in order to be part of the governing body. So they'll have to pay fees to the governing body, the regulatory body, which means that it's not as accessible as a practice, and fewer people are able to be Reiki practitioners. So if we have a governing body, a regulatory body, let's call it the Reiki Accreditation Organization, the RAO. Let's say that the RAO, in charge of Reiki, wants to set its fees to be a Reiki practitioner at $200 a year. And so every year you have to pay $200 to the RAO in order to be a member and in order to practice and teach Reiki. Who knows? Maybe the RAO may even have different levels where if you want to be a practitioner, it's $200. If you want to teach, it's $400 a year, whatever. But they can set those amounts. And if you want to practice, you've got to pay. So cost is a huge con of regulation. Another drawback to regulation is unnecessary requirements. And so as practitioners, we may be required to take classes on things that are really not relevant. For instance, we might be required through regulation to take anatomy classes when, let's be real, we don't need anatomy classes. Another con is defining the standards by which we must practice. And by this, I mean, let's say that you are offering sessions to others. The regulatory body would determine exactly what happens in a session. So these are the things that you have to do in each session. These are the things that you have to cover. These are the things that you can and cannot do. Oh, and by the way, these are the outcomes that you have to have. This is a tricky one for sure, isn't it? Because we know that with Reiki, we cannot guarantee any outcomes. But if there are standards, if Reiki is regulated, then would there be a requirement to have certain outcomes for clients? And regulation really calls into question what Reiki is anyway. So, what is Reiki anyway? Is it a spiritual practice? And if it's a spiritual practice, how can you regulate that? And if you do regulate it, is it a spiritual practice then? So regulation really does call into question exactly what Reiki is in the first place. And one of my big questions about regulation is who determines the standards? So who gets to decide what can and cannot be taught in the different levels? Who gets to decide what can and cannot happen during a Reiki session and what that is supposed to look like? So who are the people who decide this, and how does that small group, that small governing body, that small regulatory body have the power over so many practitioners? Now, is this a good thing? Yes, for the reasons I mentioned it can be, but also not for the reasons I mentioned it can't be. My personal biggest concern is with the cost and how prohibitive it could be from people becoming Reiki practitioners with the cost of training and certification and etc. Now, regulation varies from country to country and state to state. So I always encourage each of us to check our state and local laws, or our country laws too, depending upon where we are, because they do vary from place to place. Always, regulation is a possibility. So in states like Massachusetts, for instance, a bill comes up every year, every couple of years about regulating Reiki. And somewhere like Florida already has Reiki regulation. Now I'm talking on the state level because in the United States, any Reiki regulation will be at the state level, and it will not be at the federal level. We don't have to worry about a wide, sweeping federal law that regulates Reiki. Well, I don't want to say that for certain, just saying, because we never know, but the chances are very, very good that regulation will be only on a state or local level basis and not on a federal level. What has been typically driving regulation in the United States, in states such as Florida, for instance, where Reiki is regulated, is the dictates of the massage board, which claims Reiki as part of massage. Now, we know that is so silly. We as Reiki practitioners know that Reiki is not massage. There's no manipulation of the muscles or tissues, or at least there shouldn't be. We know that this is not part of the system of Reiki, but again, without standardization, someone could do that and call it Reiki. But typically when we see attempts at regulation in states, it's with the massage board calling Reiki massage, which of course is just all about getting the money, because then the Reiki practitioners have to be certified in massage, and how convenient is that for the massage board? So let's be real that on some level, regulation is about money. Yes, it can be about protecting the student and the client, just like regulating paint and fire alarms and car seats is about safety, but we also know that there are very few concerns about safety in Reiki. So what do you think about regulation? Should Reiki be regulated? Should Reiki be standardized? What do you think? Join us in the Reiki Business Collective Facebook group and tell us all about it at facebook.com/groups/Reiki Biz. Sending lots of blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Thanks for tuning in to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, and send to a friend. Learn more about the Build Your Reiki Business program at standingstoneshealing.com/build. Sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business.